Hi guys, this is day 23 of the A2 Economics Revision Challenge, and today we are doing Phillips Curve. When we look at Phillips Curve shows us the relationship between inflation and unemployment, and the argument that the economist Bill Phillips in 1958 came up with was this: that he showed a negative correlation between the rate of unemployment and the rate of inflation. In other words, when the unemployment rate is going down, the inflation rate was going up, and he used historical data to show these variables. Now, why is there a relationship between or negative relationship between unemployment and inflation? Well, if the government, for example, decides to cut unemployment through what we call expansionary fiscal or monetary policy, let's say the government decides to lower interest rates to basically increase the AD curve, or the government decides to increase government spending through fiscal policy to increase the AD curve, there will be a rise in AD, and therefore there will be a rise in employment, but there will also be a rise in price levels. So, money wages, according to the economists, money wages will have to be raised in order for us to attract new workers in the market, because workers are unemployed, they're not working, they might be voluntarily unemployed because they might not be happy with the wages that are out there, and in order to attract them, we basically make the demand to go up, which will cause inflation to happen in the economy, but will also cause unemployment to go down. So let's see this in terms of a diagram to show how there will be a rise in AD and therefore a rise in price level, and that can help us basically to find out or draw our short run Phillips curve. So if you look at this diagram here, let's say currently price level is P naught and GDP is at Y naught, and the government, let's say, says that at this Y naught unemployment rate is, for example, 7%. Now, if the government wants to reduce this unemployment rate of 7%, the government decides to basically increase aggregate demand by expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. So, AD curve goes to the right to what we call expansionary fiscal or monetary policy or demand side policies basically, and the result will be there will be a rise in GDP from Y0 to Y1, but at the same time the price level will go up, let's say by 5% or 6%. So what we're trying to see here is just that if I draw on the other side my Phillips curve, which shows us the relationship between inflation rate on my y-axis and unemployment rate on my x-axis, let me write this, unemployment rate on the x-axis, I will have an inverse relationship like this, where when your inflation was lower, because the price level was lower, you had an unemployment of, for example, 7%. So at Y0, we have unemployment of, let's say, 7%. So let me write this 7% here. So unemployment, U for unemployment is equal to 7%, and pi bar for inflation rate. So, but at Y1, when the GDP went up, because the AD went up, unemployment rate went to, for example, 6% or 4%. So let me just change this to also not U but UE, just to have the same symbols. So this is UE, unemployment rate of 7%, it goes to, for example, unemployment rate of 4%. So what we try to say is this, that the unemployment rate went down because the AD went up, but at the same time the price level went up from P0 to P1, which means inflation went up as well. Let's come up with numbers, for example, from 3% to, for example, like 5%. So I'm just randomly coming up with the numbers. The idea goes to this, that a rise in AD, let me write this, AD goes up, the price level goes up, which means a higher rate of inflation, but at the same time unemployment goes down as GDP goes up, which is exactly what your short run Phillips curve is telling us. Now, why am I saying short run and long run? Because there is a distinction between short run and long run, which I'm going to explain in 1 minute. So the idea goes this, that a rise in AD that happens through fiscal or monetary policy may attract new workers to work. Those who are voluntarily unemployed because they might not be happy with the wages, but that actually in turn causes inflation to happen. Now, monetarists had a different view about this. So, the monetarist view when it comes to Phillips curve is this, that, let me write this, monetarist view. The monetarist view is simply different. They say this, that this trade off, let me write this, trade off between unemployment and inflation may occur only in the short run, but not in the long run. So they argue this, that this disagreement, they have a disagreement here, because they say this, that unemployment and inflation may have a short run trade off but not in the long run, which means that in the short run you may see a rise in inflation causes unemployment to go down, but not in the long run. According to them, the fiscal and monetary policy will have no effect on unemployment in the long run. But what they also argue is this, that if you use fiscal and monetary policy in the long run to take care of the voluntary unemployment, you may end up causing inflation to occur. In fact, you may end up accelerating inflation to happen. So they come up with this idea, let me write this, that if demand side policies are adopted to fix the voluntary unemployment, it will end up accelerating inflation. I'm going to show that through something called the theory called expectation augmented Phillips curve. But before I talk about that, I want to show you the long run Phillips curve of the monetarists. The monetarists feel that LR long run Phillips curve or LRPC has this shape. So I'm going to write inflation rate here and unemployment rate here. And according to them, the long run Phillips curve is completely vertical like this. So this is my long run Phillips curve, which means you can see this, even if the price level is going up or inflation is going up, the symbol is pi, inflation rate is going up from pi naught to pi 1, you may not see unemployment UE to change, and this is what we call UE star. And this UE star, according to them, is your unemployment at full employment. Now, I want to go back to discuss what monetarist view is about long run and full employment, which is something which we discussed earlier. But let's just quickly recap this. That the idea goes this, that according to the monetarists, there will be full employment in the long run. So there will not be any unemployment in the long run. The only unemployment that happens in the long run, which happens at full employment, is what we call voluntary unemployment. The voluntary unemployment are all those people who are basically frictionally unemployed, who are looking for better work and may not be willing to work right now, but may work probably if there is some changes that can happen through what we call supply side things. Like, for example, if people get better information about the kind of work that they want or the kind of pace that they want for that particular work, then they may decide to work. But let's say if you look at full employment has some kind of unemployment which is roughly 2 to 3%, and that is basically happens at YF or unemployment UE star, let's write this to be 3%. Now, if the government is unhappy with this 3% unemployment and they're like, you know what, let's reduce this, and they do what we call a demand side policy, and let's say we are at point A. So, according to the Keynesians, according to the monetarists, you may end up basically at this point B in the long run because of what we call a rise in inflation rate due to a wrong policy. And why do they say that? They say that because there is something called a theory called expectation augmented Phillips curve. Expectation augmented Phillips curve is this idea that when people are going to augment or improve their expectation about inflation, then they will end up not working. So I'm going to explain this concept, which is an important concept for a lot of MCQs that come about expectation and inflation. So let's assume that this is my long run Phillips curve right now, and let's say right now the unemployment rate is 4%, and let's say this unemployment 4%. I'm going to say UE star is your unemployment at full employment, which means that this is your 4% is all those people who are unemployed because of, let's say, frictional reason or voluntarily unemployed. So remember that unemployment that happens in the full employment level is basically all the voluntary unemployment. Now, according to the monetarists, there is also a short-run Phillips curve that has to be drawn. This short-run Phillips curve is basically, let's call it SRPC naught. That means, let's say, my long-run Phillips curve at an inflation rate of, for example, 4%. But this 4%, or let me choose another number, let's say is 5%. So inflation is 5% and unemployment is 4%. Now, what the monetarists argue is this, that when you draw this curve, there is also an expectation of inflation. And let's say the expectation of inflation is also what the real inflation is, which is 5%. So, according to the monetarists, there is no difference between the inflation rate, which comes from the interaction between the short-run Phillips curve and the long-run Phillips curve, and let's say I'm at point A, and there is no difference between what people are expecting. People are expecting 5%, and in reality, there is also 5% inflation. So, that's one thing to start off with. And right now, we are in equilibrium with unemployment rate of 4%. The important point to understand here is this, that there is no difference between what people are expecting and what the reality is. The reality is inflation is 5%, and also the expectation is also 5%. Now, let's say government is unhappy and government says this, that this 4% is too much. Let's reduce this 4% to something lower, and they do what we call the demand side policies. So they do demand side policies like fiscal and monetary policy of expansionary nature, and they end up causing AD to go up in order for people to come and work in the labor market. When that happens, when AD goes up, you will see unemployment to go down. People who are voluntarily unemployed will decide to work because the payments are increasing, so the money wages are going up. People decide to leave their homes or leave their decision of being voluntarily unemployed and decide to work, and that's the unemployment goes down to, let's say, 2%. So this is UE1 of 2%. So we are moving from A to B point. Now this is very good for the economy because people are basically coming back to labor market because they're working because of higher AD, but that also because we are already at full employment, but that also means that when the AD goes up, we were at full employment, remember, that will cause the price level to go up, and when price level goes up, you will have an inflation rate that will go up. So let's say when we move to point B, suddenly the inflation goes up from 5% to, let's say, 8%. Now that is not a good news for people who are deciding to work. They came to the market thinking that the inflation is 5%. when the AD went up, their expected inflation is still 5%, but when at B point they are expecting inflation is 5%, they are working because you can see this that the unemployment rate has gone down, so they're working thinking the inflation is 5%, but because the AD went up, inflation went to 8%. So there is what we call an economic concept which comes a lot in MCQs. There is what we call money illusion. This money illusion is the idea saying this, that your real wage is going down, but you are thinking because your money wage is going up, your real wage is also going up. Money wage is going up, why? Because the AD went up, but because the price level also went up, your expectation is 5%, in reality is actually 8%. Sooner or later, people will augment their expectation. They will realize this, that you know what, the inflation is not 8%, it's not 5%, but it's actually in reality 8%. When they realize that, the Phillips curve will move to the right. Short-term Phillips curve will move to the right from SRPC naught to SRPC 1, where now the expected inflation is not going to be 8%, but it's not going to be 5%, but will be 8%. Which means when people augment their expectation or improve their expectation about inflation from 5% to 8%, we will move to point C. The short-term Phillips curve will move to the long-run Phillips curve, and ultimately will come back to unemployment rate of 4%. The lesson that we learn from this is basically when we do demand side policies for voluntary unemployment, which is basically more like supply side in nature, we will only end up accelerating inflation. That's why they came up with this idea of this long run Phillips curve to also, or this unemployment to also be narrow. They call this unemployment rate, which is the natural rate of unemployment, as narrow, which is non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Basically, when you are at U star, you will not accelerate inflation, but if you deviate away from U star, you will only end up accelerating inflation. By doing demand side policy, the government has accelerated inflation. And what is the way to go forward? Well, the way the government should have gone forward is that they should have used what we call supply side policies. Had they used supply side policies, let me write this, supply side policies for this kind of an unemployment that happens in full employment, supply side policies would have resulted in the long run Phillips curve to shift out. So what would have happened is that if the government was to shift not out, to shift backward. So I want to show this in terms of a diagram as well. So if we use supply side policies and your long run Phillips curve is at unemployment rate of, for example, 4%, but if you use supply side policies, let me write this, inflation rate, unemployment rate. So if you use long run supply side policies, the whole LRPC curve, long run Phillips curve, will shift backward. Something like this will happen, and now unemployment rate will go to, let's say, 2%. So people who are voluntarily unemployed, when they realize this, that because of better, let's say, information or because of better skills, they are able to get employed. That's basically through what we call supply side policies. So monetarists are a big fan of supply side policies. They say this, that if you want to solve unemployment in the long run, you need to do supply side policies. Demand side policies are only short term fix, and they will only cause inflation to happen, and that's exactly what their argument is. A lot of MCQs come on shift of the LRAC curve, of the Phillips curve. Phillips curve will shift to the right because of improvement in the expectation of inflation. So inflation rate, expectation of higher inflation rate can shift the Phillips curve to the right. And also one more MCQ that comes, which I want to talk about, is this, that when you draw a particular Phillips curve, What do you assume to be constant? Well, what we assume to be constant when we have this kind of a particular curve is the expected rate of inflation, because if this expected rate of inflation changes, the Phillips curve will shift to the right or to the left depending on the expectation. Also, the long run Phillips curve will shift if there is basically changes in what we call voluntary unemployment in an economy.